Welcome in, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are incredibly excited to welcome you to another custom-tailored deep dive.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating one lined up for you today.
We absolutely do. If you're listening right now, you know exactly what we do here. We take a massive stack of source material, we comb through the noise, and we extract the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge, putting them together just for you.
Right, distilling it all down.
Exactly. And today, our mission is an ultra-long, incisive, and truly fascinating exploration of a highly provocative new ebook that has been making serious waves across the internet.
Massive waves. It's everywhere.
It really is. It is called The Feminist Aesthetic, Redefining Beauty, Reshaping Society by Conrad Riker, copyright 2025.
It's a heavy text, for sure.
Very heavy. Now, before we even start pulling apart the threads of this one, I want to explicitly tell you, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show right now.
Yeah, definitely hit that subscribe button.
We do these deep dives regularly, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Also, our goal today is to really hook you on these concepts. So if you want to follow along, or if you want to read the full, unapologetic text for yourself after we wrap up here, you absolutely need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
It's readily available on both of those platforms.
Yep. You also want to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his ultra-long form, incisive content.
And it is definitely a text that is generating a massive amount of conversation right now. And the audience it is speaking to is highly specific.
That's a great point to start on, to set the stage for you listening. This book is written specifically for men. In particular, it is aimed squarely at a men's rights activist audience and red-pilled manosphere men who feel that traditional masculinity is currently under intense attack in the modern world.
Right, that's the core demographic he's writing for.
Exactly. The author's stated goal is to thoroughly unpack the history of our societal institutions, examining what they looked like, how they functioned, and how they thrived before, as he argues, they were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
He goes deep into that historical analysis.
He really does. He is offering a deep, unapologetic, historical, and cultural analysis meant to give guys a framework for understanding the cultural water we are all currently swimming in.
And because of the specific nature of that audience and the deeply ingrained cultural critiques the author makes, I want to give a quick heads up for you listening.
Yeah, please do.
Riker's book dives headfirst into the culture wars. It contains highly politically charged content and deeply controversial viewpoints regarding gender, history, and modern social movements.
It pulls zero punches.
None at all. So, just to be entirely clear up front, our goal today isn't to take a side, agree, or disagree with the author.
Right.
We are not endorsing these political ideologies, nor are we here to condemn them. We are simply acting as an impartial mirror to the text.
Exactly. Just reflecting what's on the page.
We are here to convey, unpack, and analyze the ideas and the history exactly as Riker presents them, so you can understand exactly what his arguments are and why they are making such a massive impact.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker's core premise isn't just a critique of one specific movement. It's a sweeping, unifying theory.
A very ambitious one.
Right. He argues that elements of society that seem totally disconnected, like the multi-billion-dollar cosmetics industry, the modern resurgence of witchcraft and emotional manipulation, have all been weaponized by modern feminism.
He ties them all together.
He views these not as isolated trends, but as deliberate tools used to completely flip the script on societal power dynamics. And he starts this entire thesis by attacking what he calls the myth of gender equality.
Which is chapter 1.
Right, chapter 1. But I want to make sure I'm following his logic right out of the gate here. Is he making a philosophical argument that men and women shouldn't be equal? Or is he approaching this from a different angle?
He is coming at this from a strictly biological and mathematical angle. Riker comes out swinging against the modern concept of equality of outcome. He argues that achieving a perfectly symmetrical 50-50 split in all areas of society isn't just difficult, he claims it is a biological and mathematical impossibility.
A mathematical impossibility.
Yes. He roots his entire societal critique in evolutionary biology. His foundational pillar is that evolution did not care about fairness, representation, or equity. Evolution only cared about one thing, which is species survival.
So he's looking back hundreds of thousands of years to explain modern boardrooms.
Precisely. He argues that for millions of years, the human species survived through a strict division of labor based on biology.
Right.
Men, fueled by testosterone, evolved for higher-risk, strength-based roles. They were the hunters, the protectors, the ones expected to face down physical threats and the elements.
A classic evolutionary model.
Exactly. Women, conversely, evolved biologically for nurturing, gathering, and complex caregiving, heavily driven by hormones like oxytocin, which promotes deep social bonding and empathy.
Okay, so how does that apply to today?
Well, Riker's view is that when modern society tries to artificially erase these biological realities through social engineering, it doesn't lead to a utopian society of equals. Instead, he claims it leads to profound societal dysfunction, widespread frustration, and eventual chaos.
He definitely leans heavily on data to back this up. He doesn't just theorize, he points to specific studies.
He does.
For instance, he brings up a landmark 1983 study titled Gender Equality in Sports. According to Riker, this study revealed that men outperformed women in 95% of physical tasks.
95%.
Right. He uses this to argue that the physical disparity isn't a result of girls not being encouraged to play sports. It's raw, unchangeable biology.
And he emphasizes the chemical driver behind that biology, which is testosterone. He points out that men, on average, possess 10 to 20 times more testosterone than women.
That's a massive difference.
It is. But Riker doesn't just stop at muscle mass or bone density. He argues that this hormonal cocktail fundamentally hardwires the male brain for traits like aggression, extreme competitiveness, and risk-taking.
Which he then applies to modern, real-world scenarios. The military example he uses is particularly striking.
The Marine Corps study.
Yeah, he cites a 2015 U.S. Marine Corps study that was designed to see if gender-integrated combat units could perform on par with all-male units. If we follow his logic, the results were exactly what evolutionary biology would predict.
What did the study show?
The book states that the mixed-gender units were slower, less accurate with their firearms, and overall less effective at maneuvering and completing physical tasks. He uses this to hammer home the idea that men and women simply are not interchangeable cogs in a machine.
To understand his angle fully, we have to look at how he scales this up from physical tasks to the fate of entire civilizations.
Okay, big picture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he draws massive historical parallels. Riker explicitly links the fall of the Roman Empire to the erosion of traditional male authority.
The Roman Empire. That's quite a leap.
He posits that Rome's decline wasn't just about overexpansion or lead pipes. It coincided with a cultural shift where traditional Stoic male leadership was increasingly questioned and softened.
Interesting.
He argues that when male authority is dismissed as oppressive, a society literally loses its protective backbone, making it incredibly vulnerable to external collapse.
I have to play devil's advocate for a second here because this biological argument naturally collides with modern economic debates, specifically the gender pay gap.
Right, the 82 cents statistic.
Exactly. We hear this statistic everywhere that women earn roughly 82 cents for every dollar a man earns. The mainstream narrative is that this is the result of systemic sexism. How does Riker address that? Does he just dismiss it?
He doesn't dismiss the 82-cent figure itself, but he aggressively attacks the mainstream interpretation of it. Riker argues that the statistic is intentionally misleading because it is an aggregate number that strips away all nuance. He claims that when you factor in specific variables like career choices, consecutive hours worked, willingness to relocate, and risk tolerance, the pay gap practically vanishes.
So he's saying the gap is a feature of biology, not a bug in the system.
Exactly. He argues that women, driven by those oxytocin-heavy biological imperatives, naturally gravitate toward fields that prioritize stability, safety, and care.
Like teaching or nursing.
Yes, professions like early childhood education, nursing, and social work. These fields are vital, but they inherently pay less than high-risk, high-stress, dangerous fields.
Which men gravitate towards.
Men, driven by testosterone and a biological imperative to accumulate resources to attract mates, dominate high-risk, high-reward fields like deep-sea welding, structural engineering, high-stakes finance, and construction.
He actually quotes the economist Thomas Sowell to cement this point, attributing the quote. Equality of outcome is a noble-sounding idea, but it's a mathematical impossibility in a world where people are inherently different.
A very fitting quote for his premise.
Riker is basically arguing that if a society demands perfectly equal outcomes across all professions, the only way to achieve that is to forcefully lower standards and sacrifice meritocracy on the altar of political correctness.
Yeah.
And he believes that actively harms society by placing unqualified individuals into roles simply to meet a quota.
Which naturally brings up the psychological toll this ideological tug of war takes on the individual. Riker spends a significant portion of the book analyzing how these biological realities clash with modern cultural messaging.
Which leads right into the next section.
Right, creating what he calls the double bind of masculinity.
This was one of the most compelling parts of the text for me. So basically, he's saying the modern man is being treated like a smartphone that's expected to run on an incompatible, totally outdated operating system.
That is a perfect analogy.
He's receiving two completely contradictory signals from society at the exact same time. How does this double bind actually work in practice?
The double bind refers to this impossible paradox. On one hand, society, and Riker argues, women in particular, based on their own evolutionary biology, still implicitly demand that men be strong protectors, providers, and stoic leaders in times of crisis.
But on the other hand,
Simultaneously, modern mainstream culture explicitly labels those exact traditional masculine traits as toxic.
it's a complete damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario.
Completely.
If a man steps up, acts decisively, and displays traditional strength, he is labeled domineering, patriarchal, or toxic.
Yeah.
But if he is deeply vulnerable, emotional, and passive, he's viewed with contempt and seen as weak.
He can't win.
Riker points to the infamous Gillette ad campaign from a few years ago, "The Best Men Can Be," as the ultimate microcosm of this issue.
Yes, he uses the Gillette ad as a prime case study of corporate culture adopting feminist ideology to lecture men.
Because it caused a huge uproar.
It did. The ad critiqued various forms of what it deemed toxic masculinity, bullying, catcalling, mansplaining. But Riker argues that the reason the ad faced such massive visceral backlash from men wasn't because men support bullying.
Right.
It was because the ad painted all of masculinity with a broad negative brush. It implied that the default state of being a man is inherently harmful and requires correction by enlightened corporate overlords.
And he looks at Hollywood, too. He talks about how the media perpetuates an impossible fantasy standard for men. He specifically calls out the modern trope of the perfect man, using Chris Hemsworth's portrayal of Marvel's Thor as an example.
Thor is a fascinating example because he represents two entirely conflicting ideals jammed into one character.
How so?
On the outside, he is a rugged, hyper-muscular, 250-pound action hero capable of incredible violence to protect his people, fulfilling the ancient biological desire for a protector.
Right, the traditional warrior.
But emotionally, he is written to be perfectly vulnerable, highly calibrated to modern sensibilities, and able to cry on cue.
So a walking contradiction.
Riker argues this is a female fantasy imposed on male characters. He says real men aren't action figures with interchangeable emotional settings. Expecting a man to possess the aggression to fight off a home invader, while also possessing the emotional softness of a therapist, is demanding a psychological impossibility.
Which leads to a very dark reality for modern men. Riker doesn't just view this double bind as annoying, he views it as a literal mental health crisis. By constantly telling men that their natural instincts are wrong and that their desire to lead or protect is unwanted, society has essentially stripped men of their core purpose.
The statistics he brings in to support this are genuinely chilling. He cites data from the CDC and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
What do the numbers say?
The data highlights that men are 3.88 times more likely to die by suicide than women.
Wow.
Furthermore, he notes that 78% of men report feeling intense societal pressure to suppress their true emotions.
And why is that?
Ironically, because when they do show vulnerability, they feel they are punished for it by the very society that demanded it in the first place. Riker paints a picture of a generation of lost men, wandering through a culture that views them as a problem to be solved rather than a pillar to be relied upon.
So, if that is the diagnosis, what is his prescription? How does Riker suggest men navigate this cultural schizophrenia?
His solution is absolute self-definition and physical separation from the critical gaze of modern society.
Physical separation.
He argues that men must reclaim masculinity on their own terms, entirely outside of societal judgment. To illustrate this, he heavily praises the men's shed movement, which originally started in Australia.
For those who aren't familiar, what exactly is a men's shed?
It's a grassroots movement where men literally build community spaces, often actual sheds or workshops where they gather to share skills, do woodwork, fix engines, and just bond.
Sounds like a typical garage hangout.
It sounds simple, but Riker argues its power lies in what it excludes. These are unapologetically male-only spaces where men can engage in shoulder-to-shoulder communication, mentorship, and resilience building without having to monitor their language or behavior for fear of offending modern sensibilities.
So no policing of their words.
Exactly. He sees this kind of unpoliced male bonding as essential for men to survive the psychological onslaught of the modern world.
That concept of policing behavior leads us incredibly well into the title concept of the book. Let's dig into chapter 3, the feminist aesthetic. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does.
When I first read that title, I assumed he was just going to talk about fashion or maybe how makeup trends have changed. But Riker argues that the feminist aesthetic is actually a literal Trojan horse.
He does. He is not talking about a specific style of dress. He is using the word aesthetic to describe the outward-facing cultural mask of modern feminism.
And the mask.
The author claims that this aesthetic presents itself to the public as a deeply benign, compassionate movement, promoting inclusivity, body positivity, and diversity.
But what's inside the horse?
Once it is welcomed inside the gates of cultural institutions, he claims it reveals itself as a mechanism for rigid authoritarian control.
He actually uses the term cultural Marxism to describe this. Now, that is a heavy, highly academic term that gets thrown around a lot in political debates. To really understand why Riker is so focused on this, how does he define cultural Marxism in this context?
To understand Riker's point, it helps to briefly look at the Frankfurt School. Imagine traditional early 20th century Marxism. It was
Right.
purely an economic theory. It viewed the world entirely as a struggle between the wealthy factory owners, the bourgeoisie, and the exploited workers, the proletariat.
Classic class warfare.
What academics associated with the Frankfurt School essentially did in the mid-20th century, according to critics like Riker, was take that structural game board of oppressor versus oppressed and map it onto culture instead of economics.
So instead of rich versus poor, it became about cultural power.
Exactly. The focus shifted to the culturally privileged versus the marginalized. Riker argues that the modern feminist aesthetic is the ultimate expression of this.
How does that look in practice?
By redefining what is considered beautiful or acceptable to fit a narrow, politically correct, and often androgynous standard, the movement enforces ideological conformity.
So they punish traditional beauty.
He claims that the feminist aesthetic deliberately demonizes traditional beauty and physical fitness because those things represent natural hierarchy and biological reality, which Marxism fundamentally opposes.
And he argues that this actually creates a massive trap for women. He heavily critiques the body positivity movement, using the famous Dove Real Beauty campaign as his starting point.
Right, the soap campaign.
And on the surface, the campaign was about celebrating all body types. But Riker argues that these campaigns subtly shift the cultural baseline to demonize conventional beauty.
A total reversal.
He claims that under the new rules of the feminist aesthetic, if you are naturally thin, symmetrical, or if you put immense effort into going to the gym and maintaining fitness, you are somehow viewed as complicit in upholding the patriarchy.
He brings in a fascinating piece of data to support this cultural shift. He points to a 2021 study published in the Journal of Health Psychology.
Oh, the gym selfie study.
Yes, the study examined the dynamics within online body positivity communities and found that women who posted gym selfies or who shared weight loss progress were frequently attacked and labeled by others in the movement as traitors.
Wow, so the movement that was supposed to liberate women from judgment just created a new set of rules to judge them by.
That is exactly Riker's conclusion. He cites a 2020 Glamour survey revealing that 68% of women under the age of 30 felt active pressure to downplay their physical appearance.
68%.
They felt pressured to dress more androgynously or hide their fitness levels just to avoid being seen as conforming to patriarchal standards by their peers.
That's incredible.
Riker concludes that the feminist aesthetic doesn't liberate women at all. It merely traps them in a brand new cage of ideological expectations, while simultaneously emasculating men by shaming them for their natural, biologically driven visual preferences.
Which naturally begs the question, how does the actual beauty industry, the people selling the lipstick and the foundation, navigate this ideological minefield?
What stands out to you about how the beauty industry reacts to this?
Well, Chapter 4 dives into the $500 billion global cosmetic industry, and this is where Riker's argument becomes wildly complex, almost paradoxical.
It is a striking paradox. On one hand, Riker looks at the modern beauty industry and acknowledges that it is, for all intents and purposes, a feminist utopia.
Right.
It is an industry where women absolutely call the shots, where female founders build incredible empires, and where the target demographic is entirely female.
He uses Rihanna's brand, Fenty Beauty, as the ultimate success story of this utopia. When Fenty launched, it offered 40 different shades of foundation right out of the gate.
Unprecedented at the time.
Right, specifically catering to women of darker skin tones, a demographic that traditional male-dominated beauty giants had largely ignored for decades. The result: the brand hit $100 million in sales in just 40 days.
Staggering numbers.
Riker concedes that this is undeniable proof that female executives understand what women want and need far better than men in suits ever could.
And this is a massive pivot in his argument. He refuses to view the industry as a force for good.
He'd axe the industry anyway.
He utterly condemns the multi-billion-dollar cosmetic machine as inherently exploitative. He argues that while female beauty moguls have brilliantly shifted the marketing conversation from the old adage of beauty is pain to the modern slogan of beauty is power, it is ultimately just a clever capitalist ruse.
It is just branding.
At its core, he argues, the industry still fundamentally thrives on the exact same mechanism it always has, creating, highlighting, and exploiting female insecurities.
He is incredibly cynical about the concept of empowerment marketing. Basically, if a company tells a woman that buying a specific $40 red lipstick is an act of political defiance or personal empowerment, they aren't actually empowering her. They are just employing a genius marketing strategy to move product while appearing virtuous.
And he backs this up by looking at the staggering financial drain this places on women. Riker highlights a jaw-dropping statistic.
This one blew my mind.
The average woman will spend roughly $225,000 in her lifetime on cosmetics, skincare, and beauty treatments, trying to meet these ever-shifting standards.
Just think about that number for a second. $225,000. Think about what a woman could do with that capital.
So much potential wealth.
She could buy a house, invest in the stock market, start a business, or secure her retirement. But instead, Riker argues, it is being funneled into a machine that promises empowerment, but only delivers temporary cosmetic fixes.
That is precisely his point regarding economic mobility. Riker's ultimate call to action for women in this section is to fundamentally reject what he calls the identity politics of makeup.
Reject the whole thing.
He argues that true liberation and empowerment can only come from radical self-acceptance and embracing natural biological reality, not from constantly purchasing products that promise empowerment in a bottle.
Makes sense from his framework.
He claims that the relentless pursuit of artificial, curated perfection isolates women, pits them against each other, and drains the very wealth they need to be truly independent.
So Riker argues this feminist aesthetic is fundamentally about shifting power and extracting wealth in the physical, visible world. But what I found really surprising is that he doesn't stop at physical beauty or economics. He actually takes this argument into the spiritual realm, specifically the modern resurgence of witchcraft.
Yes, moving from the cosmetics counter to the realm of the occult is one of the most provocative leaps in the book.
It really is.
Riker argues that there is a deep, deliberate alliance between modern witchcraft, alternative spirituality, and the feminist movement.
He paints a very vivid, almost cinematic picture of the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C. He describes the sea of thousands of women wearing pink pussy hats, holding signs that explicitly read things like "Hex the patriarchy."
I remember seeing those photos.
He also details how, shortly after the 2016 election, covens of feminist witches literally gathered in New York City and organized online to cast a synchronized mass spell designed to bind Donald Trump from doing harm.
Literal spells.
Riker argues that we shouldn't just laugh this off as fringe, eccentric behavior. He views it as the literal weaponization of spirituality.
What's fascinating here is how he uses a deep historical breakdown to contextualize why he finds this so dangerous. Riker looks at the European witch hunts, which span roughly the 15th to the 18th centuries.
A very dark time.
The text notes that during this dark period, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft, and a staggering 75 to 80% of those victims were women.
Horrific mass hysteria.
It was a horrific period of persecution. However, Riker's controversial argument is that modern feminists have entirely co-opted and distorted this grim history.
How so? Because the modern witch aesthetic seems entirely focused on female empowerment.
That's the illusion, according to Riker. He argues that feminists have transformed what was historically a tragic persecution into a modern political weapon of misandry.
Misandry, hatred of men.
Right. He claims they use the imagery of the witch, the rebel, the outcast, the woman who needs no man. not for actual spiritual enlightenment or connection to nature, but specifically to frame traditional masculinity and patriarchal structures as a literal disease or a demonic force that must be hexed and eradicated.
And he points out how this has permeated mainstream pop culture, making it seem totally normal. He points to hugely popular shows like the original Charmed or Netflix's The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina.
Great examples.
He argues that these shows sanitize the occult and legitimize the demonization of men. They consistently portray witches as heroic feminist icons who are constantly battering against oppressive, male-dominated patriarchal systems, often literal male demons.
If we zoom out to the societal level, Riker warns that this spiritual manipulation is having profound, isolating effects. He points to the rise of the sacred feminine movement, which he claims is actively alienating men from religion and spirituality altogether.
He has data on this too, right?
He does. To support this massive cultural shift, he cites a 2019 Pew Research study showing that while 60% of women identify as spiritual or religious, only 40% of men do.
A 20-point gap.
The gap is widening. Riker argues that by framing modern spirituality as an exclusive tool for female political empowerment and exclusion, feminism is creating a zero-sum spiritual gender war that leaves modern men feeling spiritually adrift and unwelcome in religious spaces.
It all comes back to reshaping narratives and controlling history, which brings us to Chapter 6. The fallacy of intersectionality and the rewriting of history. Let's unpack the core concept here, because intersectionality is the buzzword of the decade.
It's everywhere now.
Originally, it was a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to describe a very specific legal problem: how overlapping systems of oppression, specifically race and gender, affect black women in ways that aren't adequately addressed by looking at race or gender alone. It was a highly specific legal framework.
But Riker argues that this specific, noble-sounding legal concept was hijacked.
Completely hijacked.
He claims it was co-opted by modern cultural Marxists to serve as the ultimate vehicle for identity politics. The argument goes like this. The architects of modern critical theory, linking back to that Frankfurt School idea, realized that economic class struggle alone wasn't enough to destabilize wealthy Western societies because capitalism had actually created a massive, comfortable middle class.
Right.
So they needed a new wedge.
Right, if you can't divide people by their bank accounts, divide them by their identities.
Exactly. They shifted the focus to an identity struggle. By weaponizing intersectionality, Riker claims they created a new, rigid hierarchy of victimhood.
The oppression Olympics.
In this new system, moral authority is no longer granted by virtue or achievement, but by how many marginalized identities a person can claim. The more oppressed categories you fit into, the higher you sit on the new moral pyramid.
And who's at the bottom?
Naturally, the straight, white, biological male sits at the absolute bottom of this pyramid, inherently labeled as the ultimate oppressor regardless of his individual actions.
And according to the book, this ideology isn't just a theory debated on college campuses. It is actively being used to rewrite history textbooks and erase male contributions across the board.
The rewriting of history is a major focus for him.
Riker lists a staggering number of historical figures who he claims are being deliberately marginalized in modern education, specifically to elevate female figures disproportionately, creating a skewed version of the past.
The examples he uses span multiple disciplines. In the history of the suffrage movement, he cites male champions like Frederick Douglass and the eccentric entrepreneur George Francis Train, arguing their massive financial and rhetorical contributions to women's voting rights are now entirely ignored.
Erased from the narrative.
In the civil rights movement, he points to Bayard Rustin, the brilliant organizer behind the March on Washington, who Riker claims is often sidelined in modern retellings.
He goes into the arts and sciences too. He argues that the towering literary achievements of a man like Ernest Hemingway, who embodied a rugged, adventurous masculinity, are now frequently taught in universities not as literary genius, but as studies in problematic toxic masculinity.
Reevaluating the art based on modern morals.
He claims the artistic revolutions of Pablo Picasso are overshadowed by critiques of how he treated his mistresses. In philosophy, giants like Aristotle and Immanuel Kant are dismissed by modern academics simply as dead white males.
And in the realm of science, he argues the distortion is even more pronounced. He claims that the world-changing foundational innovations of men like Thomas Edison and Louis Pasteur are frequently reduced to caricatures, or their flaws are magnified, while female scientists like Marie Curie are elevated to almost mythological status.
Not that she didn't deserve it.
Riker's not arguing that Curie wasn't brilliant. He is arguing that the historical lens is being deliberately distorted to fit a modern feminist ideological framework that demands female supremacy in the historical narrative.
But the consequences of this aren't just about dead historical figures. Riker connects this rewriting of history directly to the environment of the modern classroom. He argues that the education system has been fundamentally structurally altered to disadvantage boys.
This is where he looks at Title IX.
Exactly. Now, Title IX was passed in 1972 with the noble intention of prohibiting sex-based discrimination in education and sports. But Riker argues it has had a devastating unintended consequence.
He points to the data on college enrollment to prove this. Riker cites that May college enrollment plummeted from 58% in 1970 to a mere 40% in 2020.
That is a massive demographic shift.
Riker argues that the modern classroom from elementary school through university has become an actively hostile environment for boys. He claims that natural male behaviors like assertiveness, physical restlessness, competitiveness, and a desire for hands-on learning are now heavily pathologized and medicated.
Treated like a disease.
Education, he argues, has been redesigned to reward the biological tendencies of girls sitting still, obedience, and collaborative group work leaving boys behind.
Which naturally leads us to ask, what happens when those boys who have been told their instincts are wrong their entire lives grow up and try to form families or enter the workforce? This brings us to the real-world fallout explored in Chapter 7.
The societal impact.
Let's start with the family unit. The statistics Riker presents here are incredibly stark. He notes that marriage rates in Western societies have plummeted by over 60% since the 1970s.
He places the blame for this collapse squarely on feminist ideology. Riker argues that modern feminism relentlessly prioritizes individual career empowerment and financial independence over the creation of a family unit.
The girl boss era.
Furthermore, he claims feminism actively frames traditional marriage, where a man provides and a woman nurtures, as an inherently oppressive, patriarchal prison.
To illustrate the sheer exhaustion of trying to live up to modern feminist relationship ideals, he shares an anecdote about a couple he calls Sarah and John.
This was a very revealing story.
Sarah was a staunch, highly educated feminist who insisted on a strict, unyielding 50-50 egalitarian split on absolutely everything in their relationship, from the exact division of rent and groceries to household chores. She actively refused to let John do things like open doors for her, pay for dinners, or take the lead in decision-making, viewing those actions as patronizing.
And the psychological result for John was devastating. According to Riker, John felt he was constantly walking on eggshells, completely unable to relax into his natural masculine desire to provide and protect. He felt like he was constantly being audited for ideological purity rather than loved. Predictably, their relationship ultimately crumbled under the immense, unnatural weight of these rigid, joyless, ideological rules.
He just couldn't last.
Riker uses this to argue that trying to override thousands of years of biological mating strategies with a spreadsheet of egalitarian chores is a recipe for misery.
The broader societal impact of this relationship breakdown, according to the text, is the meteoric rise of broken homes. Riker cites U.S. Census Bureau data showing that 23% of children now live in single-parent homes, and a staggering 80% of those homes are headed by females.
A huge demographic shift.
He argues that the cultural dismissal of the father's role, the idea that women don't need a man to raise a family, undermines the crucial stabilizing force of fathers, leading directly to higher rates of childhood poverty, behavioral issues, and incarceration.
And paradoxically, he points out that this supposed liberation hasn't actually made women happier.
He has a Pew study on that, right?
He cites a 2021 Pew study showing that 58% of single women aged 30 to 44 reported feeling generally dissatisfied with their lives, compared to only 38% of married women in the same age bracket.
Wow, 58 versus 38.
Riker's blunt conclusion is that feminist empowerment, by destroying the complementary dynamic of traditional marriage, has led to profound isolation, exhaustion, and unhappiness for the very women it promised to liberate.
And the corporate workplace is just as fraught, if not more so, according to the book. Riker uses the 2018 firing of Google engineer James Damore as his ultimate cautionary tale for the death of corporate meritocracy.
Damore is a crucial figure in Riker's argument. In 2018, Damore wrote an internal memo at Google questioning the company's aggressive diversity initiatives.
The infamous memo.
Crucially, Damore used the exact same evolutionary biology arguments Riker uses, suggesting that biological differences in interests and risk tolerance between men and women, rather than rampant sexism, might explain why there are fewer women in high-stress, technical software engineering roles.
The backlash was instantaneous. Google fired him, and the media labeled him a sexist. Riker argues that Damor's firing proves that facts and biological reality no longer matter in the corporate world. Meritocracy and open debate have completely eroded in favor of meeting diversity quotas and maintaining ideological purity.
Riker expands this critique to target corporate human resources departments, which he views as the enforcers of the feminist aesthetic.
HR as the enforcers.
He is highly critical of mandatory toxic masculinity and diversity training programs. He argues that these HR programs actively pathologize the very traits, like bold assertiveness, relentless ambition, and cutthroat competitiveness that historically drive technological innovation and business success.
The traits that build companies.
By neutering these male traits, he claims corporations are stifling their own potential.
He also tackles the Me Too movement in this workplace context. Now, Riker does acknowledge that the movement rightly exposed some truly horrific real predators who abuse their power.
He concedes that point.
However, he claims the cultural pendulum swung so far that it created an environment of absolute guilt until proven innocent.
He argues the fallout of Me Too is that it has made men absolutely terrified to interact with women in professional settings.
The Mike Pence rule.
He claims men are now afraid to mentor young female employees, to hold closed-door meetings, to lead dynamically, or to participate fully in public corporate life, entirely out of fear that a single unverified accusation or a misinterpreted joke could instantly and permanently destroy their careers and reputations.
And how does that affect women?
Riker argues this ultimately hurts women, as they are now cut off from vital male mentorship and networking.
We have covered an immense amount of ground here, from evolutionary biology to cosmetics, from witchcraft to corporate HR. This brings us toward the climax of Riker's overarching argument. After laying out this massive web of cultural capture, what is his ultimate point? What does this all mean for the future?
The author's ultimate conclusion is a very stark, very dire warning. The continued, deliberate erosion of male leadership will inevitably lead to total societal collapse.
Total collapse.
Riker isn't speaking metaphorically. He looks to history for proof, citing the ancient Minoan civilization.
The Minoans.
The Minoans are often romanticized by modern historians as a peaceful, matriarchal utopia that worshipped goddesses. But Riker points out that this civilization completely collapsed around 1450 BCE.
They got wiped out.
He uses the Minoans as a historical cautionary tale, arguing that societies that elevate female, nurturing leadership at the direct expense of rugged male authority and martial strength become soft. They lose their protective edge and struggle to sustain themselves against aggressive external threats, invading armies, or natural disasters.
So Riker's demand is a full-scale, unapologetic return to complementary gender roles. He insists that masculinity, with all its aggression, competitiveness, and stoicism, is not a flaw to be corrected.
It's the foundation.
He views it as the foundational bedrock of human civilization. His ultimate call to action for the men reading his book is to violently reject the guilt imposed on them by modern society. He demands that men reclaim their traditional biological roles as the unquestioned protectors, providers, and leaders of their families and communities.
Patriarchs.
And crucially, he demands that men absolutely refuse to participate in, validate, or bend the knee to the feminist aesthetic.
And it is vital to note that Riker asserts time and again throughout the text that this proposed return to tradition is not about oppressing women.
Right, he makes that distinction.
He frames his entire argument as a matter of cold, hard pragmatism and civilizational survival. He genuinely believes that recognizing the unchangeable biological and historical differences between men and women and honoring those complementary strengths rather than trying to erase them is the only possible way to restore cultural balance and prevent the complete unraveling of Western society.
It is a massive, unapologetic, and incredibly controversial thesis from the first page to the last. For you listening, this is exactly why we wanted to do a deep dive on the feminist aesthetic. Redefining Beauty, Reshaping Society by Conrad Riker. It is a text that challenges the current mainstream narratives at every single turn, demanding that its audience look at history, biology, culture, and power dynamics through a radically different, unflinching lens.
And as we wrap up our analysis of the author's arguments, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over something that builds on Riker's source material but looks toward a very different kind of future.
I love these final thoughts.
If the author is entirely correct that our institutions and our survival are defined by an ancient evolutionary biological division of labor men as the physical protectors and risk takers, Women as the nurturers, what happens in a rapidly approaching future dominated by artificial intelligence.
Oh, well.
When AI and advanced autonomous robotics render both traditional male physical labor, military combat, and modern corporate ladder climbing completely obsolete, will these biological imperatives force humanity to invent entirely new artificial gender roles just to satisfy our evolutionary wiring? Or will the inevitable rise of the machines render these biological culture wars completely obsolete altogether?
Wow, that is an incredible question to ponder. What happens when our ancient biological imperatives collide head-on with the technological singularity? Do we adapt, or do the old rules just cease to matter? I absolutely love that thought. Well, that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. I want to remind you once again that everything we discussed and analyzed today was based entirely on the provocative ebook, The Feminist Aesthetic, Redefining Beauty, Reshaping Society by Conrad Riker.
A really intense deep dive today.
Definitely. If this discussion hooked you and you want to dive into the full unapologetic text yourself to see all the historical data and arguments we couldn't even fit into this deep dive, I explicitly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook. You will also want to make sure you follow the author at Conrad in Riker on Substack for more of his incisive, ultra-long form cultural commentary.
Highly recommended if you want the full picture.
And finally, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our show right now so you never miss out on these custom-tailored journeys to the most fascinating source materials out there. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Keep thinking critically, and we will see you on the next deep dive.